The man kneeling on the marble had stopped begging in English, so Dominic Ricci waited for him to try another language. He was a good waiter. He sat at the head of the long black table on the 42nd floor with his jacket off and his cufflinks catching the low gold light, and he did not look at the man on the floor, and he did not look at the blood, and he let the silence do the thing silence did better than any threat. The man's name was Petrov. 2 hours ago, he had been Dominic's translator. 1 hour ago, Dominic had learned that Petrov had taken $40,000 from a Genovese cousin to soften a single phrase in a phone call last spring, a phrase that, softened, had cost the Ricci family a warehouse and very nearly a war. "I have children," Petrov said, in Russian now, as though a different language might reach a softer man. "I know," Dominic said, in Russian, "without heat. That's why you're leaving this building on your feet." He finally looked at him then, and whatever Petrov saw in that flat, patient gaze made him go the color of ash. "You'll go somewhere warm. You'll never be in a room where business is spoken again as long as you live. And every night for the rest of your life, you'll wonder whether the reason nothing has happened to your children yet is that I forgot or that I haven't finished deciding." He tipped his head toward the door. "Get him up." 2 men lifted Petrov. He didn't struggle. Nobody struggled. On the 42nd floor, that was the whole point of it. When the door closed, Dominic Ricci sat alone with the city glittering behind the glass and did the arithmetic of his ruin. Petrov gone meant Dominic had no one he trusted to sit between him and the meaning of things. And in 90 minutes, the most important meeting of his year was going to fill this room with 4 men speaking 5 languages, and Dominic Ricci, who ruled the eastern seaboard with the sharpest tongue in it, was going to have to walk into that meeting functionally deaf. He had been deaf for 3 years. Since the night a translator he'd trusted with his life sold 1 sentence to a rival, and that sentence put his younger brother Marco in a car that did not survive the bridge. Dominic had buried the translator, and he had buried Marco, and he had learned to run half his world by reading faces instead of words, because he would rather be blind than betrayed again. Tonight, the blindness was going to be expensive. He did not know that the person who would fix it was, at that moment, 42 floors down, arguing with a security guard about a signature. Rosa Vasquez had been holding a bag of veal for 11 minutes, and it was going cold, and the guard behind the lobby desk still would not let her upstairs. "Corporate account needs a signature," she said, for the 3rd time, keeping her voice pleasant, because she had learned a long time ago that a heavy woman in a cheap delivery jacket did not get to be short with a man behind a desk. The app says, "Delivered to hand." Somebody in the building has to sign, or I don't get paid, and I already drove it here, so... The guard sighed, the particular sigh of a man who had decided her whole existence was an inconvenience. He made a call. He listened. He hung up. "Side elevator," he said. "You wait in the 42nd floor vestibule. Somebody'll come sign. You don't go past the vestibule." "Wonderful," Rosa said, and meant it, because wonderful cost nothing, and being difficult cost everything. The side elevator smelled like money and cold metal. The 42nd floor vestibule was a small marble antechamber with a bench, a coat closet, and a wall of frosted glass that separated it from whatever went on beyond. There was a ventilation grill low in that wall, some architect's afterthought, a return duct feeding the conference room's air back out into the building's lungs, and Rosa sat on the bench with the bag on her knees and did not, at first, pay any attention to it. Then the voices started coming through it. She noticed because they were interesting, and Rosa had spent her whole life noticing when voices were interesting. There was an American, clipped and controlled, a voice that never rose but that the other voices arranged themselves around. There was a second man, older, European, warm as poured honey, who spoke English to the American, and then turned away and spoke something else, Hungarian to 2 associates, low and fast, and every time he did it the honey went out of his voice, and something colder came in. Rosa understood the Hungarian. She understood it the way she understood breathing. She sat very still on the bench and listened to the warm-voiced man tell the American, in English, that they were so close, only the final clause remained. And she listened to the same warm-voiced man turn to his own people, in Hungarian, and say, "When my associate reads the clause aloud, watch the boy who translates for Ricci. He doesn't hear the difference. He never does. 2 words. That's all. 2 words, and the company is ours. Rosa's stomach dropped straight through the 42 floors below her. She was a food delivery driver. She was in the wrong place. She was not supposed to have heard that, and she was even less supposed to have understood it. And every survival instinct she owned, instinct sharpened over 10 years of learning, that being noticed only ever hurt, told her to set the bag on the bench and walk back to the elevator and pretend her ears didn't work in 4 languages. She almost did. Then, through the grill, she heard a young man's voice, the boy Varga had meant, Ricci's translator, nervous and eager to please begin to read the clause aloud in Serbian. And she heard him read it exactly the way the warm-voiced man had wanted. The 2 words changed, the meaning flipped, the trap laid clean. And then she heard the American say, calmly, "Read it once more, slower." And she heard, under the calm, something she recognized, because she'd heard it in her own father's voice 100 times in 100 clinics and courtrooms in 100 cities where they didn't speak the language and were being cheated and knew it and could not prove it. She heard a man who understood he was being robbed and could not hear how. Rosa Vasquez stood up. She would never, for the rest of her life, be entirely able to explain what happened next. She crossed to the frosted glass. There was a door in it, propped her hands width open for the vestibule's air. She put her hand on it. And a woman who had spent a decade perfecting the art of not being seen pushed it open and said, in perfect Serbian, into a room full of the most dangerous men in New York. That's not what the clause says. For one long, suspended second, nobody in the room breathed. Then she said it in English, because the English had built up behind her teeth and would not stay down. That's not what he read you. He read you a different version. He changed 2 words. Every head at the long black table turned toward the doorway, toward the heavy-set woman in the cheap jacket with the paper bag of veal going cold in her hands. And Rosa watched the contempt arrive on their faces in real time, the automatic, weary contempt of powerful men for an interruption shaped like her. All of them except one. At the head of the table, the American she knew, without being told, that this was the one they all leaned toward, rose slowly out of his chair. He did not look at her the way the others did. He looked at her the way a man lost at sea looks at a light on a shore he'd stopped believing in. Alexander Varga recovered first. He laughed, light and gracious, and murmured to the bodyguard by the door. In Hungarian, "Get the delivery girl out. She's confused." She heard a word she thought she knew. Rosa looked directly at him and answered, in Hungarian, "I'm not confused. And 2 minutes ago you told these 2 men to watch whether Ricci's translator caught the switch. He didn't. I did." Varga's smile did not so much fall as freeze, like water going to ice. At the head of the table, Dominic Ricci said one word, very quietly, and the whole room strained to catch it. "Explain." Rosa's heart was slamming against her ribs. Her hands, around the bag, had gone slick. But this, the meaning of words, the gap where liars hid this, was the one ground on earth she had never once lost her footing on. The clause was read in Serbian, she said. Your man translated it into English as, either party may exit the partnership after 18 months, and each party's assets remain under its own control if the deal dissolves. That's not what's on the page he read from. On the page it says the Budapest party may exit not either party, and it says the New York party's assets transfer to the consortium as collateral if the deal dissolves. She swallowed. He read you one sentence and translated another. The difference is your whole company, and your man didn't lie to you. He just wasn't fast enough to hear it. Silence. Dominic Ricci looked at her across 40 feet of black marble, and then he looked at Varga, and Rosa watched something move behind the American's eyes, not shock. She'd expected shock. This was worse, and colder, and much more frightening. This was a man who had suspected exactly this for 40 minutes, and had just been handed the proof, and was now deciding, in real and unhurried time, what to do with it. Mr. Varga, Dominic said, slide the document to me, the original, the one your associate read from. Mr. Ricci, Varga said smoothly, surely you're not going to let him. Slide it, Dominic said, and he did not raise his voice, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees, and Rosa understood, all at once and in her spine, exactly what kind of man she had just made herself visible to. Varga slid the document down the table. Dominic, read it. He read Serbian. It turned out not fluently, not fast enough to catch a two-word switch spoken aloud at speed, but well enough, given the page in front of him and the translation now in his ear, to see precisely where the seam was. Rosa watched him find it. She watched his jaw set. He did not shout. He did not overturn the table. He simply looked up at Alexander Varga and smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Rosa had ever seen a human face do. "Get them out," he said. It took 11 minutes to clear the room, and Dominic Ricci did all of it without once lifting his voice above conversational, which somehow made it worse. Varga's associates were escorted. Varga himself left last, pausing at the door not to look at Dominic, but to look at Rosa. A long, cold, measuring look, the look a man gives a lock he intends to come back and break. Rosa met his eyes and did not look away, and only she knew her knees were shaking so hard she'd braced one hand against the wall. When the door closed, the enormous room held only Dominic Ricci, two silent men against the far wall, and a delivery driver, still gripping a bag of food she'd spent 40 minutes trying to hand off to someone. "Come here," Dominic said. Every instinct she had screamed, "Run." The elevator was 10 steps behind her. This was a man who, 90 minutes ago, she didn't know that, but she felt the shape of it in the room, in the way that two men against the wall held themselves, had done something to somebody that had left the air like this. She set the bag on the table instead and walked toward it, because she'd already broken the one rule that had kept her safe her whole adult life. She'd let herself be seen. There was no unbreaking it now. "Your veal's cold," she said, when she reached him. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'd offer to reheat it, but I don't think that's the conversation." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, adjacent to one. "5 languages," he said. 6. I didn't count English. "Where?" She braced for the version of the question she'd heard 1,000 times, the one that came with a certain expression, "How does someone like you?" But he wasn't looking at her like that. He was looking at her like she was the answer to something he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped saying it out loud. "My family were immigrants," she said. "We moved wherever there was work. Belgrade, Budapest, a year outside Moscow, 2 in Naples, back to Queens. I was the one who learned each new place's language first, so I could talk to the landlords and the clinics and the men who wanted to cheat us. I got good at hearing when people were lying in a language they thought protected them." She lifted her chin. "That's why a delivery girl speaks Serbian. Whatever you're about to offer me, the answer's no, and I'd like my signature so I can go home." "In 3 years," Dominic said, as though she hadn't spoken, "you're the first person who has told me the truth about a room while standing inside it." He studied her, and his gaze wasn't the kind that made her want to shrink. It was the kind that made her feel, unnervingly, red. "Someone taught you to hide that, to make yourself quiet. Who?" She hated that he'd seen it. She hated more that she answered. "Everybody loves a smart girl," she said, "until she's a smart girl who looks like me and delivers their dinner. Then it's so educated, and still doing this. Like my brain's a joke the universe is playing." She shrugged, a small, hard motion. "It's easier to just not. Now, my signature." Dominic Ricci looked at her for a long moment. Then he took a heavy pen from inside his jacket, signed her delivery slip in a hand like cut wire, and held it out, and when she reached for it, he did not let go. "I want to offer you a job," he said. "You'll say no now. You'll come back tomorrow anyway, because a man left this building tonight who watched you catch what you caught, and by morning you're going to understand that you don't get to be invisible anymore. Not to me, and not to him." He released the slip. "Ask the guard downstairs for a car. Whether you take it tells me everything I need to know about how well you understand the world you just walked into." Rosa took a slip and walked to the elevator and did not look back, and rode 42 floors down with her heart in her throat. And when the guard asked if she wanted a car, she said no, absolutely not, and drove home in her own, rattling Honda. She lay awake all night, thinking about the way Varga had looked at her at the door. In the morning, she called the number on the card that had somehow found its way into her jacket pocket. She told herself it was only about safety. For the first 2 weeks, she was almost able to believe it. Dominic put her in a building he owned 3 blocks from the tower for her protection, he said, and she let herself accept the fiction. She did not move in with him. She noticed that he was careful about that. The apartment was hers, separate, with its own door and its own lock and no expectation attached that she could feel. It was the first thing that surprised her about him. She'd expected a man like that to take up all the available air. Instead, he seemed to spend a great deal of effort making sure she had some. The work was harder than she'd thought, and she was glad of it, because the days it was hard were the days she believed she'd earned it. The first week, she nearly got something badly wrong. They were reviewing a recorded call, a Neapolitan supplier, a dispute over a shipment, and Dominic had asked her to tell him what the man on the tape was really saying. Rosa translated it cleanly, confidently. The supplier was apologizing, offering to make it right, deferential. She was proud of how fast she'd done it. Dominic listened to her, and then he played the tape again. And then he said, "You heard the words. You missed the room." "Excuse me?" "He's not apologizing." Dominic leaned back. "In Naples, in our business, when a man apologizes that elaborately, that quickly, to someone he owes, he's not sorry. He's stalling. He's telling you he has no intention of making it right, and he wants you to feel too gracious to push. The words are an apology. The meaning is a threat wearing an apology's coat." He looked at her, and there was nothing unkind in it. "You translate language better than anyone I've ever met. But my world has a second language underneath the first one, and you don't speak it yet. You will. But right now, if I'd acted on your translation, I'd have thanked a man who was about to rob me." Rosa sat with that, and it stung, and it was also the most useful thing anyone had said to her in years. "Teach me," she said. And he did. That was the part she hadn't expected, that the most feared man in New York would sit with her at a long table, late into the evening, and teach her the grammar of his terrible world. Which silences meant fear, and which meant contempt. How a Russian said yes when he meant never. The particular warmth that meant a man was about to betray you. She'd spent her life mastering the languages people spoke. He taught her the language people were, and she watched him, over those evenings, do something she suspected he almost never did take genuine, quiet pleasure in a mind that could keep up with his. She got good at it. Within a month, she was catching things even he'd have missed: a Milanese banker skimming, a Russian intermediary saying, of course, in English, while telling his own men stall them in Russian. The men who'd looked through her that first night learned to go silent when she spoke. She stopped being furniture. She started being the sharpest instrument in the room. And Dominic Ricci changed, slowly. Against his will, she could see it was against his will, and somehow that made it land harder. It started small. He learned she skipped meals when she was nervous, and food began appearing good food, real food, no note. He learned she loved the old harbor at the south end of the city, the foggy one where the container ships slid in like ghosts, and one gray morning the car simply went there instead of to the office, and he stood beside her at the railing for an hour and said almost nothing, and it was somehow the most either of them had ever said. He did not touch her. That was the thing that undid her. A man the whole world feared kept a careful, deliberate distance from her, as if he understood, without being told, exactly how many men had gotten too close to a heavy, quiet woman without asking. He'd lean over her shoulder to read a document, and she'd feel him stop, feel his warmth go still an inch away, and then withdraw, jaw tight, like he'd caught himself reaching for a live wire. One night, working late, she looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had no defense against. "You're staring," she said. "I know. Why?" He was quiet a moment. When he spoke, it was low and even and honest, in a way that frightened her more than his violence would have. "Because I have spent my whole life being the most dangerous thing in every room I enter, and a woman handed me a bag of veal and heard a betrayal in 4 languages faster than I could breathe. I've had no quiet moments since." He set down his pen. "I've buried or bought every problem I've ever had. I can't do either with you. I find I don't want to." The air in the room went thin. Dominic. She'd stopped calling him Mr. Ricci weeks ago. Neither of them had marked when. "You've seen what I look like. Men like you don't." "Don't," he said, and it was the first time she'd ever heard heat crack his control. He came around the desk. He stopped. Again, that same careful distance, and this time when he lifted his hand, he did not pull it back. He tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and his fingers trembled. This man whose hands did not tremble. "Don't tell me what men like me want," he said quietly. I have never wanted anything in my life the way I want to keep you exactly where I can hear you. Whoever taught you that your mind was a joke and your body an apology was a liar, and I don't tolerate liars. She kissed him, or he kissed her. Neither of them could ever say who moved first, and it didn't matter, because for one long, dangerous, spinning moment, the most feared man in New York held a plus-size delivery girl like she was the one fixed point in a turning world. Then his phone rang, and the light went out of everything. Varga had not been idle. The call was Dominic's head of security, and it was short, and Dominic's face turned to stone as he listened. When he hung up, the man who'd been trembling 10 seconds ago was gone. Something older and colder had taken his place. Varga's moving, he said. For 2 weeks he's been quietly buying up my creditors. And an hour ago he filed the real partnership documents, the honest ones, the ones you exposed with an arbitration board in Geneva. Claiming I altered the translation to defraud him, a muscle worked in his jaw. He's flipped it. He's telling every family from Naples to Moscow that the Richies faked an interpretation to steal a European partner blind. If the board believes him, it's open season on us. He took my own trap and turned it around. And the only proof that he lied first is me. Rosa's blood went cold. I'm the only witness that he changed the words. I'm the entire case. Which means, Dominic said, very quietly, that Alexander Varga now needs you gone more than he needs anything else in the world. That was the night the black SUVs appeared outside her building. They were not Dominic's. What followed, Rosa would remember the rest of her life in fragments. The way you remember the seam where your life splits into before and after. She remembered Dominic getting her out through a service corridor, his body between her and every doorway, one hand flat and steady against the small of her back, a man who had spent his whole life letting others take the bullets, putting himself into the space where a bullet would go, without 1 second's hesitation. She remembered the parking garage, 2 men stepping from behind a concrete pillar. And the way Dominic moved, she had spent a month hearing that he was dangerous, and now she saw it, and the 2 things were not the same at all. There was no drama in it. It was fast and economical and over before her mind caught up, and afterward he stood breathing hard with blood on his shirt. That was not his, and the first thing he did, the very first thing, before anything else was crossed to her, take a face in his hands and search it. Are you hurt? Not a word about the men on the ground, only that. She remembered the safe house on the stormy coast, grey stone and salt wind an hour north of the city, the one place Varga's money couldn't reach. And she remembered the night, 3 days in, when Varga called Dominic's phone and asked to speak to her. Dominic did not want to give her the phone. She took it anyway, and walked to the window and looked out at the black water while the storm threw itself against the glass. The clever delivery girl, Varga said in Serbian, silk over steel. You've cost me a great deal, but I'm practical. Come to Geneva. Testify that Ricci pressured you, that you were confused, that your languages aren't as good as you pretended. You walk away rich and alive. Refuse the silk thinned and I'll make you disappear so completely that even that frightening man beside you won't find a piece of you to bury. Rosa was quiet. She was aware of Dominic across the room, gone very still, watching her, ready, she understood, to take the phone and end this his own way the second she wanted him to. And part of her wanted him to. Part of her, the part that had spent 10 years staying small and safe, wanted to hand the phone away and let the dangerous man handle the dangerous thing. But she was not that woman anymore. She'd stopped being that woman in a marble doorway with a bag of cold veal. No, she said, in English. Just that. She didn't perform it in 5 languages. She didn't need to. The documents were notarized and filed the morning after your men showed up at my building. Every altered clause, from memory, sealed and sent. It was done before you ever thought to call me a beat. You built everything on the bet that nobody was really listening. You bet wrong. She hung up before he could answer, because she'd learned from the best man in the city that the one who ends the silence loses it. The room was quiet except for the storm. Dominic Ricci was looking at her the way a man looks at a sunrise in a room he'd thought would be dark forever. You already sent it, he said, before he called, before I even knew what he'd filed. The night the SUVs came, she said, and now her hands were shaking, now that it was over. I wasn't going to be a witness somebody could make disappear, so I made the truth into something that couldn't. He crossed the room and took her face in both his hands, bloodless now, gentle, and pressed his forehead to hers. And for a long time, the man who ruled New York with words did not have a single one. The arbitration board ruled 6 days later. Rosa's documentation, time-stamped, notarized, brutal in its detail, did more than clear Dominic. It laid open 9 other deals Varga had poisoned across 3 countries, and the European families who had been ready to hunt the Rickies turned instead on the man who'd lied to them. Alexander Varga did not make it to a courtroom. Men like Varga rarely did, once their own kind stopped needing them. He simply stopped being anywhere, and no one asked where. And Rosa understood that some questions were safer left in the languages no one says out loud. Dominic offered to send her anywhere in the world. New name, new life, more money than her family had made in 3 generations. The chance to disappear again safely this time, the way she'd spent her whole life wanting. He offered it at the railing of the foggy harbor she loved, the one where the ships came in like ghosts, and she understood what it cost him to offer it. He was standing between her and the dark, one last time, even when the dark was him. "You'd let me go," she said. "I'd hate every second of it." He looked at the water, not at her. "But yes, you spent your whole life being taken from your future, your name, the right to be seen. I won't be one more man who keeps you somewhere you didn't choose." A pause. "You gave me back the thing I lost 3 years ago. I can at least give you back the choice." The fog moved over the harbor. A ship slid in, silent and enormous, out of the grey. Rosa thought about the girl in the doorway with the cold veil, about a lifetime of making herself smaller so the world would let her pass. And she looked at this dangerous, careful, unbearably lonely man who had never once, not for a single second, made her feel small. "When I was 18, she said, I had a scholarship, UN track. I was going to sit in a booth between world leaders and be the reason they understood each other." She smiled a little at the water. "Then my father got sick and the scholarship didn't cover a hospital, and I started driving and I stopped speaking, out loud, in every language, for 10 years. I told myself it didn't hurt." She turned to him. "I don't want the exit, Dominic. I've been trying to exit my own life since I was 18. I finally have one. I don't want to leave." Dominic Ricci feared across 2 continents, mourner of a brother, ruler of a machine that ran on words, pulled the delivery girl no one had ever noticed into his arms at the edge of a foggy harbor and held her like the one thing his money could not have bought and his power could not have taken. He said one word into her hair. Then he said it again, in Italian, in Serbian, in Russian, in Hungarian, in the rolling coastal dialect Varga had been so sure no one in his world could touch, so that she would understand it completely, in every tongue the world had tried to convince her didn't belong in a mouth like hers. "Stai." And the girl no one had ever noticed stood in the arms of the man everyone feared, at the edge of a harbor where the ghost ships came in from the sea, and let herself, at last, be found. 42 floors above Manhattan, in the room where the most dangerous man in New York conducts the business of an empire, there is a paper bag from a small Italian restaurant, framed behind glass. He keeps it to remember a simple, ruinous truth that the most valuable thing he ever received was carried up to him by a woman the whole world had trained itself not to see, and that he very nearly sent her back down in the elevator. He listens differently now, to the quiet ones, to the ones holding the door, because you never know which of them speaks. 5 languages no one bothered to ask about, and holes in a paper bag going cold, the one thing that could save your entire world. Somewhere above Manhattan, a paper bag still hangs framed behind glass, a reminder that the most valuable thing in the room was the one nobody thought to look at twice. Rosa spent 10 years believing that being seen could only cost her something. It took a room full of dangerous men, and one who finally listened, to teach her that being heard was the thing she'd been starving for all along. If Rosa's voice reached something quiet in you, leave a like so this story finds the next person who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you believe the overlooked ones deserve their moment, and share this with someone who's been waiting a long time to be truly seen. And tell me, if you'd spent your whole life staying invisible to stay safe, what would it take for you to finally speak?